After the Civil War, thousands of newly freed African Americans left rural areas for cities such as Lexington in search of jobs, security, and opportunity. From 1860 to 1870, Lexington's black population more than doubled, from about 3,000 to 7,000. But housing was in short supply. Only a few property owners would sell or rent homes to blacks. Therefore, most African Americans settled into urban enclaves, such as Brucetown, Kincaidtown, Goodloetown, Pralltown, and Davis Bottom. Close to downtown, these neighborhoods were located near factories, railroads, stockyards, and in swampy, disease-prone areas known as bottomland.
Bottomland is land that is low-lying, easily flooded, and is unsuitable for use for agriculture and for what we would call an estate building. But it was perfectly good to subdivide and to sell these lots to the newly freed African American or any immigrant family, because we find in the Davis Bottom area, not only did we have African American families, but we also had white families.
Before development, Davis Bottom contained a creek, marshlands, pastures, a coal yard, and 2 quarries. A railroad line ran along the northern ridge. The southern ridge held the remnants of a Civil War fort. Fort Clay was one of 2 fortifications built in Lexington by the Union Army to defend against Confederate attacks. In 1865, William Willard Davis bought and subdivided 43 narrow lots in the valley that now carries his name. Willard Davis was an attorney, a Republican politician, and a staunch advocate for civil rights. He was also a land speculator. Davis was one of several Republicans who developed neighborhoods for African Americans in Lexington after the Civil War. National politics played an important role in the early history of Davis Bottom. On July 4th of 1867, a crowd of 10,000 people, mostly African Americans, gathered for a day of picnics, music, and speeches in a wood about a mile south of Lexington. It was one of the largest civil rights gatherings held in Kentucky during the period of Reconstruction. Willard Davis was a keynote speaker, and one of the first residents of Davis Bottom was surely there. Robert Elijah Hathaway, a Union Army veteran, was a founding member of the Kentucky State Benevolent Association, which helped organize the event. According to the Cincinnati Commercial, the immense crowd stood for hours, quietly listening to speeches from leading civil rights advocates, Reverend John Fee, Judge Goodloe, General Brisbane, Reverend Graham, and Willard Davis. After supper, Davis spoke about the plight of blacks in Kentucky. He decried state laws that prohibited African Americans from testifying in state courts and from voting. This unprecedented gathering was sparsely covered in local newspapers, but the Cincinnati Commercial published a detailed description of the event, including the text of all of the speeches. 9 days later, Charles Sumner carried a copy of the Cincinnati Commercial to a debate in the U.S. Senate over funding for the 3rd Reconstruction Act. One of a series of Reconstruction measures, the legislation would place Confederate states under military rule to enforce federal laws on basic civil rights. The debate turned into a heated argument between Senator Sumner of Massachusetts and Senator Garrett Davis of Kentucky. Sumner was a leader of the radical Republicans who sought strict Reconstruction measures. Garrett Davis, a member of the minority Democratic Party, favored more lenient legislation. Davis accused Sumner of secretly lobbying to add Kentucky, which stayed with the Union, to the list of Confederate states targeted for federal Reconstruction. Davis also charged that stories from congressmen of wrongs and crimes committed in southern states against blacks and Union men were the greatest fictions of this day. In response, Sumner read excerpts from the speeches delivered on the 4th of July in Lexington. He cited speech after speech describing the systemic oppression of blacks in Kentucky. Specifically, Sumner quoted the words of Willard Davis.
The right to act for yourself, or to say who shall act for you, is higher than all human law, and no state can deprive a freeman of this right and be Republican in fact. Willard Davis, 1867.
The U.S. Congress easily passed the Third Reconstruction Act on July 19, 1867. Kentucky remained exempt. But the debate between Senators Charles Sumner and Garrett Davis brought national attention to the social and political conditions for African Americans living in Kentucky. The 4th of July gathering in Lexington was a landmark event for civil rights in Kentucky. Speeches presented that day reverberated all the way to the U.S. Senate. And there, at the forefront, were two men with ties to Davis Bottom: Willard Davis, the neighborhood's namesake, and Robert Elijah Hathaway, who just 3 years earlier had been enslaved, the property of U.S. Senator Garrett Davis. There are few archival records about daily life for the first generation of residents in Davis Bottom, but nearly everyone leaves a faint paper trail.
Many times what's missing from working class communities in the archival record are personal accounts, diaries, things that are common when you're dealing with large wealthy farm owners, things like that. So you have to go to civic records like deeds, city directories, and also census records are very important. They show a lot of information. Those kinds of information reveal occupation, race, marital status. Sometimes you'll get things like income level, whether they own property. It really gives a pretty detailed account of someone's life that you would not have otherwise.
Historic newspapers are another valuable source of information.
Oh, I get very, very excited when I find that there isn't a written account of any one working person's life. When you start compiling those tidbits of information, you kind of get a picture of who this person was.
Some of the first residents of Davis Bottom were Union Army veterans. U.S. colored troops often used their Army pay to buy or rent property after the Civil War. One such soldier was Robert Elijah Hathaway. Hathaway enlisted with the 100th USCT Infantry at Camp Nelson on June 6, 1864. The 100th Infantry guarded the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad and fought in several campaigns. During the Battle of Nashville, 128 soldiers from Hathaway's unit were either killed or wounded.
Robert Elijah is discharged from his unit in December 1865. He's discharged in Nashville, Tennessee, but he makes his way back home, as most of the soldiers did. And he comes to Lexington to live with Isham and his mother.
Robert Hathaway, his stepfather Isham, and another relative likely pooled their Army pay to buy a homestead on West Pine Street on the North Ridge of Davis Bottom.
The property stayed in the Hathaway estate from 1865 to 2008, when it was transferred to our museum for care and development for the Memorial Park. That in itself is a record. It's a treasure. It's a legacy that we build on.
By 1880, the population of Davis Bottom had grown to 387 residents, according to U.S. Census records. It was a young neighborhood. The average age was 23. 69% of the residents were identified as black. 31% were white. The census records also show black residents had limited job opportunities.
A lot of times, especially in the early records, they just list them as laborers, or for the males, even some of the females were often listed as cooks, servants. When you get into around the turn of the century, that's when you start to see some of the details. They were tinners, janitors, they were doorsmen, some of the women were seamstresses. They even started saying that they owned some of their own businesses. But a lot of the bigger businesses, such as the railroad companies or the tobacco factories, were the employers in Davis Bottom.
Flooding dictated the development of homes in Davis Bottom. The first homes were built on the highest ground. Some areas were never developed due to high water. Archaeologists hoped excavations would provide details about early residential life. However, all of the sites from the late 1800s were impacted by decades of flooding and construction.
When things get churned up, as we call it, if things get disturbed, somebody puts in a utility line or something, it mixes up all the artifacts. And so you no longer have that temporal control, so to speak, in trying to associate various events or various activities or various occupants. And so you're limited in that way. So for archaeologists in general, context is crucial.
We actually had several examples of artifacts that certainly could have been manufactured as early as, I would say, even 1860, 1880. We had medicine bottles that certainly could have dated as early as 1875, 1880. This is a piece of whiteware with a maker's mark, and this maker's mark may have dated as early as 1847. They did use it into the early 20th century. However, because it was recovered in a disturbed context, it makes it really difficult to say exactly when it was used, and that was really typical of some of the early artifacts that we did find at Davis Bottom.
There are only a few biographical records about the first generation in Davis Bottom. The most detailed accounts come from the Hathaway family. Robert Elijah Hathaway worked as a waiter before finding his true calling as a Christian preacher. His wife, Rachel, had 3 children, Fanny, Eva, and Isaac, before her untimely death in 1874. Robert made sure his children received an education. Fanny became a prominent teacher and principal. Eva became a nurse. And Isaac Scott Hathaway became a nationally recognized sculptor and professor.
We know that Isaac as a child was a very talented young man. He was already drawing and painting and experimenting with plaster and clay. Robert Elijah, Isaac's father, recognized this and supported it. They sent him to a school, the Lexington Normal Institute, where teachers had an appreciation for art education as well as the basics, seeing that these children knew their ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. So he was surrounded by people who understood the value of art education.
While at the Institute, Isaac received the nickname Big Boots. Money was so tight, he wore his father's old Army brogans to school. Isaac excelled in all of his classes. His artistic career was molded at the age of 9 during a trip to Ohio. In 1881, Robert and Isaac Hathaway visited an art exhibit in Cincinnati. The exhibit featured marble and bronze sculptures of important figures from American history. Isaac wandered off in search of a bust of his hero, Frederick Douglass.
When his father finally found him in this museum, he said to him, as most parents would, "Why did you leave us? Why weren't you here with us?" And Isaac says to his father, "I was looking for a statue of Frederick Douglass because my teacher said all important people are in bronzed." He could not find an image of Frederick Douglass. Isaac's father said to him, "Well, there are no Negro sculptures." And Isaac says, "I'm going to make busts of Negro people and put them where everybody can see them." I can't imagine how many 9-year-olds do I know, do you know, that would make this statement and stick to it. Given the time frame, 1881, we're still dealing with antebellum sentiment. Not having a role model to follow, truly knowing what the economic situation of the family was, not being able to afford art lessons. How was he going to do this? How did he do it?
After graduating from high school, Isaac worked as an English teacher. He also earned money illustrating medical textbooks and painting racehorses. This portrait of Queen Bon is the only one known to have survived. Hathaway used his art commissions to pay for higher education, not only for himself, but also for his two sisters. In 1894, Isaac studied drawing and painting at the New England Conservatory in Boston. In 1899, he took more studio courses at the Art Academy of Cincinnati.
Almost everyone speaks of his quiet determination, his dedication to what he was doing, his self-belief. He had to believe in himself in order to get this far. His support of his family. He couldn't have continued on in his art career without the support of his family. But I just think he was very determined, not in an aggressive way, in a very quiet, assertive way. And he didn't let the era of racism, of Jim Crow laws, stop him.
When combined, all of the research lines begin to form a picture about life in Davis Bottom during the late 1800s. Davis Bottom had a lot to offer young families. There was greater security and better access to health care and education. The Freedmen's Bureau, benevolent societies, missions, and churches provided most of these social services. Many Davis Bottom residents attended nearby Pleasant Green Baptist Church. In 1874, Pleasant Green started one of Lexington's first schools for African American students.
Although, from an archaeological perspective, we don't know a lot about those daily life ways, at least from my investigations. It seemed to be an inclusive neighborhood. The archival suggests that they were going to churches nearby, they had their own schools, and it's just a close-knit community that it seemed that not a lot of people in the rest of Lexington really knew about it. It was its own neighborhood with its own flourishing families.
At the turn of the century, paved roads, sidewalks, electric lights, water lines, indoor plumbing, and telephones began to appear in downtown Lexington. Only a few of these modern conveniences found their way to Davis Bottom. Nevertheless, this diverse neighborhood became the destination for another wave of urban immigration.